3 Local and Global Communication in Multicultural Settings. Before we move in with our topic, let us take a look first at the learning objective of our lessons. At the end of this chapter, the student should be able to discuss and define communication in multicultural settings, determine appropriate terms, expression, and images like sensitivity to gender, race, and class, adopt cultural and intercultural awareness and sensitivity and communication of ideas, identify effective ways of communicating within the influences of individual cultures. At chapter 3, we are going to tackle about communication, intercultural communication. Topic A, culturally appropriate terms, expression, and images. Topic B, world Englishes and English as an international language. Topic C, linguistic preferences and nonverbal behavior. Topic D, tips for successful multicultural communication. Topic E, tips for non-native English speakers. And last topic F, varieties and registers of spoken and written language. Communication in multicultural settings. Communicating across cultures is challenging. Each culture has set of rules that its members take for granted. People read into information based on their knowledge of it, and their knowledge is ultimately shaped by their culture and environment they are in. It is important to understand that what is defined as appropriate in terms of communication can differ from person to person or culture to culture. Next slide. So before we move into our main topic, let's have cultural understanding. Cultural understanding means influences our personal preferences in communication and continues to influence our perception of others throughout our lives. So why do we need cultural understanding? You need to understand where you are coming from as a group, a society, organization, or a community, or as a person. You have to accept your background, where you grow up in, who you grew up with, and what are the characteristics of values and manners in it. So having cultural understanding, you are being cultural aware. When you apart, knowing you and knowing the others as well. Because when you know, you can better relate to others. So having cultural awareness means knowing that there are multiple differences based on religion, ethnicity, nationality, and other factors, okay? So what is multiculturalism? Multiculturalism is a person respectful and engaged with people from distinctly different culture called multiculturalist by Gumbel T. Gumbel. It is the view that culture, races, and ethnicities, particularly those minority groups, deserve special acknowledgement of their differences within a dominant or political culture. Just like it is a coexistence of diverse culture, where culture includes racial, religious, or cultural groups and is manifested in customary behaviors. Some some are cultural assumptions and values, like patterns of thinking and communicative styles. It is the kind of policy that aims of protecting a cultural diversity. Next. So there are challenges in multiculturalism. First, trouble with accent and fluency, differing attitudes toward hierarchy and authority, conflicting norms for decision making. So, a trouble with accent and fluency. Although English is the international language, misunderstanding or deep frustrations may happen because of non-native speakers' accent or lack of fluency or the problem with translation and usage. The next one is differing attitude towards hierarchy and authority. So for example, in a Korean or and US negotiation, the Americans are having difficulty getting the information from their Korean counterparts. So they complain directly to the higher levels. So the crisis was only resolved if they have understanding in both culture and having the understanding between their medium or the language. Okay. And lastly, conflicting norms for decision making. So culture differs in terms of making decision, how quickly it should be made, and how much analysis should be done beforehand. Not surprisingly, like some people make decisions very quickly compared with a person with a different race or from the different nations. Next, improving intercultural communication. So we can improve our communication in different cultures by simplifying your message. Never shout to be understood. Avoid non-standard abbreviation. Be patient. Ask people to repeat it. Remain cool and composed. Clarify their message and intentions. Ask yourself and make that message are consistent. These improving these tips are going to be elaborated by the next reporters. Next. So what is intercultural communication? Humans are formed by forces that genetics, family backgrounds, religious affiliation, educational achievements, sociocultural forces, economic conditions, emotional states, and other factors that shapes human identities. Because this there's no people that can be exactly the same. So it's like from the previous definitions that culture can be considered as a system of knowledge, beliefs, values, custom of attitudes, and other that can be acquired within the society. Okay. So now defining the intercultural communication. Intercultural communication refers to the communication between from two different cultures according to Chen and Estra Rosa. So intercultural communication is the exchange of information between two individuals who are unlikely culturally. There's the word unlike culturally. So intercultural communication is symbolic, interpretive, transactional, contextual process in which people from different culture create a shared meaning. So intercultural communication is identified as both a concept and a competence. Intercultural competence is mm, the active position by individual of qualities which contribute to effective intercultural communication and can be defined in terms of three primary attributes like knowledge, skills, and attitude. So intercultural is when we encounter with a diverse or cultural background such as interaction with other people. Just like when a Filipino, I talk to an American, I am doing intercultural communication. So another example is a Christian confers with a Muslim, or a woman receives an order from a man. An American and African share their views, or a Chinese politician discusses a treaty with American leaders. So in intercultural communication, there are also challenges. We have mentioned a while back that when we are not that diverse, we don't understand the diverse culture outside our culture, it can lead to misunderstanding or miscommunication. Why? Probably because each of the speaker and the receiver have lack of shared knowledge and belief and the cultural diversity, which make it more complicated to arrive at the cultural diversity, which makes it complicated to arrive at the correct interference, or interpretation of the message. So, intercultural communication is also called in various ways: multicultural, cross-cultural, interracial, interethnic, and international communication. Next slide po. So, there are forms of intercultural communication. First, we have interracial. So, when we speak of interracial communication, this is a kind of communication wherein you communicate from other races. Okay, take note the word different races. That is why it's called interracial. You know, for example, you know a Filipino talking to American or a foreigner that is already interracial. As a Filipino, you got a set of beliefs, traditions, and manners that have characteristics, and you try to mingle with a foreigner that has their own. So by doing that, you may encounter several barriers, but still you are able to do it because you have your own understanding of your own culture that are several different from the two of you. So interracial happens between two nationalities. Okay. Next, next we have interethnic. So when we speak of interethnic communication, it's a interacting with people of different ethnic origins. So it's between ethnic origins. For example, Chinese, Filipino, Hispanics. That is ethnic origins. So this may come people may come from the same country or they may live together in the same area. But for example, ethnic groups includes Hispanics and Han Chinese. So it may be considered or common in a certain ethnic groups that they have lived together with the same area, but they don't have the same origin. Okay. The next one is international communication. So when we speak of international communication, we are communicating between the representative from different nations. Okay, different nations. So we already have these United Nations. These are represented by the people, of course, representing their own nations. We also have the ASEAN region. That's why we have it. It's a worldwide. And the ASEAN is just with the Southeast Asian nation. Example of international communication is when an advertisement, a political speeches, or journalistic news stories, social media posts, press release, and books and print publications and more. Next and lastly, the intracultural. When we speak of intra, meaning within, okay, within, it's interacting with the member of the same group or co-culture, meaning the same. Just like in the picture shown, a Filipino talking to a Filipino, okay? So when you talk with a Filipino, that's already intercultural. Or for example, you're a Pangasinan, you talk to a person who's also talking in your mother tongue, which is Pangasinan. That's intracultural, okay? So another example is intraculture in variation refers to especially cultural differences between individuals, all of you who belong to the same or larger cultural groups. For the instance, Hispanics, Asians, that includes multiple distinct national and local culture. So next. However, according to Gumble and Gumble 2008, there are different communication styles among culture. So what are those? We have high and low context communication. So what is this all about? So when we speak of high context communication, it is a traditional, okay, is a traditional link communication system which adheres strongly to being indirect. Okay, remember that it's indirect. That means to say when you try to explain with or when you try to explain to another people or communicate with other people, you try to get your point, okay? Why? Because the two of you have different language, and for you to be able to understand, for you to be able to understand by your listener or receiver, okay, you make or tend to associate words or things for your receiver or your listener to understand you. So that's high context for you. An example is, have you ever seen a married couple have an entire conversation without speaking a word? Through nothing more than glances and curled eyebrows. That's high context communication. On the other hand, when we speak of low context communication, it's a system that work on the straightforward communication. So when you speak that work straightforward communication, okay, that means to say you no longer or use or associate words with other things because you both understand what you are saying and talking. Both of you understand the point, okay? Which you are saying that is why it's called low context communication. So it's straightforward. You don't need to go around to the bush. Next. So there are also potential areas for misinterpretation and intercultural communication. So according to AJ Scholar, miscommunication is in a cross-cultural settings can be minimized if one is aware of the different areas wherein misinterpretation can occur. So he came up with a list of potential hotspots in intercultural communication, which more often than not have become areas for miscommunication. So looking into these areas and studying them before interacting with people from other culture can greatly help or lessen the obstacles one would need to navigate in communication. So here are the potential areas for miscommunication. So when opening and closing conversation, so different cultures have different ways of going about addressing someone in terms of whom should be addressed first or how they should be addressed and why they can be addressed. Who speaks the first or who closes the conversation can also differ because addressing someone in a manner that is not common in particular culture can often be seen as rude or disrespectful. Next is taking turns during conversation. So, there are appropriate ways of interacting with other people in all cultures. In some taking is often welcome where areas. In other culture, listening and reserving comment after the conversation is preferred. But other culture believe that giving an immediate response can be seen as a challenge or humiliation. Next one is interrupting. In some culture, interrupting during a conversation can be acceptable, especially when it is within the context of the interaction. However, um, in other culture, interrupting in the middle of conversation, regardless of your point being made, can be viewed as impolite. So using silence is also can be interpreted in many ways depending on the culture in which one is interacting. Some cases, silence before the response to a conversation would give them the impression of thoughtfulness. But on the other hand, silence can also differ or come into a sign of hostility or indifference to others. So we should also use appropriate topics in conversation. Appropriate topics could largely depend on the situation of the person and the culture one belongs to. So in some cultures, talking about money can be seen unethical and embarrassing. But some others, one can easily talk and ask about how much a person earns. Just like in Asian culture, uh, talking about family issues with those who are not part of the family can be constructed as inappropriate. So here at the Philippines, Asian family protects family issues firstly, okay? So appropriateness of topic to discuss is not only determined by where one is from, but also by their religion, educational background, and ethnicity. We should also take note that using humor is one of the potential areas which can lead to misinterpretation. So, in Western culture, using humor is often used as icebreakers in communication to help establish rapport with others. In some ways, rumors is used to make atmosphere less stifling and more relaxed. But in other cultures, using humor in conversation may seems to be disrespectful. So you should also know how much you're going to say because many people from Western culture prefer communicating in a straight to the point manner, whereas those from Asian culture are less confrontational, thereby utilizing a more indirect approach in discussing a certain manner. Lastly, sequencing elements during a conversation. So, when to say things in is important as what one says, how one says thing. A speaker should always consider the timing in which he or she should introduce a topic, or often people struggle about when they should change direction in terms of the conversation. Okay, next. So we can improve our intercultural communication by this. So the following intercultural communication tips are provided to help people working in international and multicultural environments get some basic insights into dealing more effectively with people and not letting culture become an issue. So one is to pay attention to your words and actions because cognizant of how your own thinking patterns, assumption, perception, and biases with others. You should study your own self and the way you interact with others based on how will you know your own gender, race, um, social status, physical appearance, and abilities. You should also control your assumptions, like questioning a lot about culture. For example, the one right way to communicate is your way. Communication breakdowns are brought about by others because you have different mind tracks, rules on interpersonal communication in your culture that having the same with all other cultures, of course. You should engage in transpection. So try to learn the feelings and perspective of others. So you should also gain knowledge because gaining knowledge by observing or discovering about others, just like in religions, you should visit places where you can meet or talk with the people with different cultures or have traditions that different from you. The more you know about a culture, the better that you can control your assumptions and the more you overcome misunderstanding. So gaining knowledge is about um, eliminating any personal biases and prejudices you have developed over the time. By gaining knowledge, you are also gaining experience. So by gaining experience in intercultural communication, it's not limited to reading, observing, or discovering or doing research at the internet about culture. You can gain true experience by actually visiting places, uh, though sometimes it is costly and tedious. However, you can also find someone for another culture and talk to him or her and ask direct questions in a conversation intended to help you to better understand. So we can lessen the miscommunication by ultimately the only way is to understand that no two individuals are alike and that every person comes from a background that may be different from one another. It is only by observing and learning the culture of other people that one can possibly lessen the gap created by our cultural differences.